Welcome to the Deep Dive. We're going deep into a case today that I think you'll find really interesting.
Always love a good deep dive.
Yeah, it's a case from the 1970s, but it's still unsolved, and there have been some recent developments that make it even more intriguing.
Sounds interesting.
It's the Doodler case. Ever heard of it?
The Doodler, yeah, vaguely. It rings a bell. San Francisco, right?
Right. San Francisco, 1970s.
A lot going on in San Francisco back then.
Yeah. A time of huge change for the LGBTQ plus community, but also a time when this really chilling unsolved case gripped the city.
A serial killer case?
Yeah.
Eh.
And the killer was known as the Doodler because he'd sketch his victims before he murdered them.
Oh, wow. That's pretty creepy. Adds a whole other level to it.
It does. It's one of the things that has always stuck with me about this case. Like, what does that tell us about the killer?
It's fascinating, right? I mean, was it a way of dehumanizing his victims?
Yeah.
Or some kind of twisted power play?
Yeah. Or even like a weird form of, I don't know, artistic expression.
Hard to say. But it definitely adds a layer of complexity to his psychological profile, that's for sure.
It does. So, okay, let's unpack this a little bit. Our sources for this deep dive paint a pretty disturbing picture of a serial killer who operated between 1974 and 1975, specifically targeting gay men.
And back then, being openly gay was incredibly risky, especially in a city like San Francisco, which was, becoming a haven for the LGBTQ plus community.
Right. So you've got this backdrop of social change, this growing movement for gay rights.
And at the same time, you have this predator lurking in the shadows, preying on this very community.
Exactly. It's like this really tragic intersection of history and crime.
It is.
Officially, there are 6 confirmed victims attributed to the Doodler.
6 confirmed. But a lot of people believe the true number could be much higher.
Yeah. Some estimates go as high as 16 or even more. It's hard to say for sure.
Right. A lot of these cases, they just went cold.
They did. And it's easy to see why, right?
Mm-hmm.
If you think about the social climate at the time, a lot of gay men weren't out. They were living in fear of being exposed, of losing their jobs, their families, their lives even.
Exactly. So if you were attacked, reporting it to the police meant potentially outing yourself.
And risking everything.
Exactly. So it's not surprising that many chose to stay silent.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's just heartbreaking to think about. But, okay, to really understand this case, we need to go back to the beginning. So the first victim that was discovered was named Gerald Kavanaugh.
Found on Ocean Beach in January of 1974.
Stabbed multiple times. And from what I read, it seemed like he fought back.
Yeah, the reports mentioned defensive wounds. He didn't go down without a fight.
And then just a few months later, 2 more bodies were found.
Joseph Stevens and Klaus Christman.
Both discovered near water. Both stabbed multiple times. Kind of similar to Kavanaugh's case.
Right. 3 white males, all found near beaches, all killed in a similar, really brutal way.
It couldn't have been a coincidence. The police had to have known they were dealing with something bigger, something more sinister.
Oh, they knew. This wasn't just a random act of violence. This was a pattern.
And a pretty terrifying one at that.
Right. I mean, you've got to think, what does this tell us about the killer's motives? Was he specifically targeting gay men? Was it something about the location, being near the water?
Yeah, it's all so unsettling.
And what makes it even more disturbing is that these murders weren't isolated incidents.
Right. There were more victims to come.
Yeah. Like Warren Andrews, a lawyer.
Oh, yeah. He was found much later, right?
Right. In 2022, they linked his death to the Doodler. He was beaten to death back in 1975 in Land's End.
So many years had passed before they made that connection.
It's crazy to think about. And then there was Frederick Koppen. He was also stabbed to death. And Harold Goldberg, his case was a bit different.
Different how?
Well, he was older than the other victims, and his clothing was missing.
Interesting. So the police were piecing together this really complicated puzzle with all these seemingly disconnected victims.
Exactly. They were trying to make sense of it all, trying to find a link.
And did they? Did they ever find a suspect?
Well, this is where it gets really interesting. They did have a suspect, a young man. They believed he was the Doodler.
But they never charged him.
No, because 3 surviving victims of the Doodler refused to testify.
Why? I mean, wouldn't they want to see him brought to justice?
They were terrified of being outed in court.
Wow. So they were basically trapped, forced to choose between their own safety and seeking justice for what happened to them.
Exactly. It's a really, really difficult situation to be in. And it highlights the incredible fear and distrust that existed within the gay community at the time.
Yeah. It's almost unimaginable to be so afraid of the consequences of coming out that you wouldn't even testify against the person who attacked you.
It really speaks volumes about the social climate back then. Coming out could cost you everything: your job, your family, your whole life.
It's just awful. So the victims were silenced, and the Doodler was essentially free to continue preying on the community.
And he did. For years, it seemed like he was going to get away with it. But then something incredible happened. Harvey Milk.
Harvey Milk, yeah. He was a huge figure in the gay rights movement.
A pioneer, really. One of the first openly gay elected officials in the U.S.
And he was elected to the San Francisco Board of Supervisors just a few years after the Doodler murder started.
1977. He was fighting for the very community that the Doodler was terrorizing.
Pushing for anti-discrimination laws, speaking out against police brutality, advocating for their safety and their rights.
Exactly. He understood the fear that was so pervasive in the community.
And he was determined to change things. And what's really interesting is that Milk actually spoke about the Doodler case publicly.
He did, and his words were, well, they were pretty powerful. He expressed empathy for the victims who chose not to testify. He understood the impossible situation they were in.
Yeah. He talked about the homophobia that was so deeply ingrained in society at the time. The homophobia that forced these men to stay silent.
It was a huge statement. I mean, here you have this prominent gay rights activist acknowledging the systemic issues at play. The fact that the justice system itself wasn't always a safe space for the LGBTQ plus community.
Right. It wasn't just about catching a killer. It was about confronting the deep-seated prejudices that allowed this tragedy to happen in the first place.
Exactly. The Doodler case exposed the vulnerability of an entire community.
And in a way, it kind of fueled the fire of the gay rights movement. It made people realize that things needed to change, that they needed to fight harder for equality, for acceptance, for justice.
It's like this horrible tragedy became a catalyst for change. It's a terrible price to pay, but it's hard to deny the impact it had.
So the Doodler was never caught. But his crimes helped spark a movement that ultimately led to greater awareness, greater understanding, and greater rights for the LGBTQ plus community.
It's a complicated legacy, that's for sure.
It is. But okay, let's fast forward a bit.
Yeah.
What about the investigation itself? Did it ever get any closer to solving the mystery of the Doodler?
Well, it remained cold for decades. But then, a few years ago, things started to heat up again.
Really? What happened?
The San Francisco Police Department decided to take another look at the case.
Why? I mean, after all those years, what was the impetus for that?
Advancements in DNA technology.
Ah, okay. So they were hoping to find some new clues, some new leads that they might have missed before.
Exactly. They re-examined the evidence, looking for anything that could be tested using these new techniques. And they even offered a $100,000 reward for information leading to the arrest and conviction of the Doodler.
Wow. That's a pretty significant reward. Did it lead to anything?
Well, they did release an age-progressed sketch of the suspect in 2019.
Trying to jog people's memories, see if anyone recognized him.
Right, hoping that someone out there might have some information that could help crack the case. And they've also mentioned that they're considering using a technique called forensic genetic genealogy.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
I've heard about that. Yep. It's the same technique they used to catch the Golden State Killer, right?
Exactly. It's been revolutionary in solving cold cases. Basically, it involves comparing DNA from a crime scene to DNA databases that are used for genealogy research. So, like Ancestry.com and 23andMe.
Oh, wow. So if they find a match, they can start building family trees and narrow down the pool of potential suspects.
Exactly. It's a really powerful tool. And it's given a lot of people hope that maybe, just maybe, the Doodler case can finally be solved.
After all these years?
Yeah, it's still a long shot. But it's a shot nonetheless. And for the victims' families, for the community that was so deeply affected by these crimes, it's a glimmer of hope that maybe justice can finally be served.
It's amazing how technology can change everything.
It really is.
Yeah.
And it makes you think about all those other cold cases out there, all those unsolved mysteries. Maybe some of them can be solved using these new techniques.
Still a second chance at justice.
It is. But it's also important to remember that even if they do identify the Doodler, it won't erase the pain and suffering that the victims and their families endured.
Right. It's not a magic fix.
No, it's more about acknowledgement, about holding someone accountable for these horrific acts, and about sending a message that even after all these years, justice can still prevail.
It's a powerful message.
Yeah.
And it's one that I think resonates with a lot of people.
It does. Because at the end of the day, we all want to believe that justice is possible, even in the face of seemingly insurmountable odds.
So even though the Doodler case remains unsolved, it's still a story of hope. Hope that technology can help us right past wrongs. Hope that the victims and their families might finally get some closure, and hope that maybe, just maybe, this case can serve as a reminder that we should never give up on the pursuit of justice.
It's a powerful reminder, and it's one that we should all carry with us.
It really is. It makes you think, even with all the progress we've made in terms of LGBTQ plus rights, we still have a long way to go.
Yeah. Sadly, discrimination and violence against the community, it's still a reality.
It is, and it kind of makes you question, like, even if they do identify the Doodler, will it really bring justice after all these years?
It's a tough question. I mean, I think for the families of the victims, it would definitely provide some sense of closure, some sense of peace, knowing that the person responsible for this horrible crime has been held accountable.
Right. But it can't erase the pain.
Right.
It can't bring back the lives that were lost.
No, it
Yeah.
can't. And that's the tragedy of it all, right? But I think it's also about something bigger. It's about recognizing the harm that was done, about honoring the victims,
Hmm.
and about making sure that something like this never happens again.
Yeah. Yeah. It's like a societal reckoning in
Yeah.
a way. Like, we need to confront the fact that this happened and that it happened because of prejudice and hate.
Absolutely. I mean, the Doodler case, it's a stark reminder of the systemic issues that often prevent marginalized communities from receiving equal justice.
Right. It's not just about catching a killer. It's about addressing the root causes of violence and discrimination.
Exactly. It's about creating a society where everyone feels safe and protected, regardless of their sexual orientation or their gender identity.
So as we wrap up our deep dive into the Doodler case, what do you think is the most important takeaway? What can we learn from this tragedy?
I think for me, it's the enduring impact of fear and silence. The fact that these victims were afraid to come forward, afraid to seek justice because of the stigma and discrimination they faced.
Yeah, it's a reminder that even in a city like San Francisco, which was seen as this haven for the LGBTQ plus community, there was still so much fear, so much prejudice.
And that fear, it had a ripple effect. It impacted the investigation, it allowed the Doodler to remain free, and it sent a message that somehow these victims were less deserving of justice.
It's heartbreaking. It really is. So I guess the question is, how do we move forward? How do we ensure that something like this never happens again?
It's a huge question, and there's no easy answer, but I think it starts with awareness, with education, with understanding the history of discrimination and violence that the LGBTQ plus community has faced.
And with recognizing that the fight for equality isn't over.
Absolutely. We've come a long way, but there's still so much work to be done. We need to continue to challenge homophobia and transphobia, not just in our laws, but in our everyday interactions. We need to be allies. We need to speak out against injustice wherever we see it.
And we need to remember that even small actions can make a difference.
They can. Whether it's supporting LGBTQ plus organizations, educating ourselves and others about the issues facing the community, or just using our voices to amplify those who have been marginalized, every little bit helps.
It's a reminder that progress isn't a destination. It's a journey, and it's a journey we have to take together. So thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the Doodler case. It's a dark chapter in San Francisco's history, but it's also a call to action. A reminder that we all have a role to play in building a more just and equitable world. Until next time, keep questioning, keep learning, and keep striving for a better world for everyone.